You walk into a history museum and see paintings of guys with crowns and fancy robes. They look important, but you have no idea why. Today, I'm going to tell you about the 6 greatest kings in history and why they still matter today, and I'll explain it all like you're 5 years old. And by the end, you'll understand how these ancient rulers changed the world so much that we still live with their ideas every single day. Think of a king like the ultimate grown-up in charge of everything. Not just your house or your school, but the entire country with millions of people. These 6 kings weren't just wearing pretty crowns for fun. They were making decisions that affected how people lived, worked, fought, and even thought about right and wrong. And somehow, thousands of years later, we're still using some of their ideas. Let's start with Hammurabi, who lived about 4,000 years ago in a place called Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. Imagine your neighborhood had no rules at all. Kids could just steal each other's toys, grown-ups could take things without asking, and nobody would know what was fair or unfair. That's basically what the world was like before Hammurabi came along. He created something called the Code of Hammurabi, which was like the world's first really big rule book. And this wasn't just any rule book. It had 282 different rules carved into a giant stone pillar so that everyone could see them. The rules covered everything from don't steal to if you hurt someone, here's what happens to you. Some of the punishments were pretty harsh by today's standards, but the important part was that everyone knew what the rules were. Before Hammurabi, kings could just make up punishments on the spot, which wasn't very fair. His code said that the same crime should get the same punishment, no matter who you were. Well, mostly. Rich people still got better treatment than poor people, but it was a start. But why does this matter today? Well, every time you see a law written down, every time someone goes to court, every time you hear that's not fair and someone actually does something about it, you're seeing Hammurabi's influence. He invented the idea of laws that should be written down where everyone can see them, and that punishments should fit the crime. That's the foundation now of every legal system in the world today. Next up is Cyrus the Great of Persia, who lived about 2,500 years ago. Cyrus was like the ultimate nice guy conqueror, which sounds like a contradiction, but hear me out. Most kings back then would conquer other places and then force everyone to worship their god, speak their language, and follow their customs. Cyrus, though, was different. When he conquered places, he basically said, hey, you can keep doing whatever you were doing before. Worship your god, speak your language, just pay your taxes and don't cause any trouble. Now, this might not sound revolutionary, but it was absolutely mind-blowing at the time. Cyrus created the world's first charter of human rights, written on a clay cylinder. It said that people should be free to practice their religion and that slaves should be freed. He didn't just talk about it either. When he conquered Babylon, he freed all the Jewish people who had been enslaved there and let them go back to their homeland to rebuild their temple. Cyrus basically invented the idea of tolerance, which means accepting that other people can be different from you, and that's okay. Every time you see people of different religions living peacefully in the same country, every time someone says everyone deserves freedom, every time we talk about human rights, you're seeing Cyrus's legacy. The United Nations Charter, the American Constitution's idea about religious freedom, and pretty much every modern idea about treating people fairly all trace back to this ancient Persian king. Now, let's talk about Alexander the Great, who lived about 2,300 years ago in Macedonia, which is near Greece. Alexander was like the kid in your class who's really good at everything and knows it. Except, instead of being good at math or soccer, Alexander was ridiculously good at conquering the entire known world. By the time he died at age 32, he had created an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to India. That's like controlling everything from New York to Los Angeles, except way bigger. But Alexander didn't just conquer places and leave. He had this crazy idea that the best parts of different cultures should all mix together. He encouraged his soldiers to marry local women, he adopted local customs wherever he went, and he spread Greek ideas about science, art, and philosophy everywhere. This mixing of cultures is called Hellenization, which is a fancy word for making things more Greek-like. Alexander's conquests created the first truly global culture. Greek became the common language that people from Egypt up to Afghanistan could use to talk to each other. Greek ideas about democracy, philosophy, and science spread everywhere. Even today, when we study geometry, we're learning from Greek mathematicians. When we talk about democracy, we're using Greek ideas, and when we go to the doctor and they use Latin words that originally came from Greek, that's Alexander's influence as well. Augustus Caesar, though, comes up next, and he's the guy who basically invented the Roman Empire around 2,000 years ago. Before Augustus, Rome was a republic, which means it was supposed to be run by a bunch of senators making decisions together. But the senators kept fighting with each other and nothing was really getting done. It was like having a classroom where all the kids are supposed to make decisions together, but they just argue all the time instead of actually learning anything. Augustus, though, was smart about how he took power. Instead of saying, "I'm the emperor now, deal with it," he pretended that the old system was still working while quietly taking control of everything else important. He controlled the army, he controlled the money, and he controlled who got important jobs. But he let the senators keep meeting and making speeches, so they felt important even though Augustus was really up in charge. Augustus created a system of government that lasted for over 400 years in the West and over 1400 years in the East. He built roads that connected the entire empire, created a professional army, established a postal system, and made sure that there was a common currency. He basically invented the idea of a professional government bureaucracy, where trained people do specific jobs to keep the country running. Every time you see money that's guaranteed by the government, every time you drive on a highway that connects different states, every time you send mail and expect it to actually arrive, you're benefiting from systems that Augustus either invented or perfected. Charlemagne, though, lived about 1200 years ago and was the king of a place called the Frankish Kingdom, which covered most of modern-day France and Germany. Europe at this time was basically a mess. The Roman Empire had collapsed, and different groups were fighting each other constantly. It was kind of like a giant playground with no teachers, where the big kids just picked on the little kids and nobody was learning anything. Charlemagne, though, changed all that. He conquered most of Western Europe and then did something amazing. He made education a priority. He started schools, brought in scholars from all over the world, and even learned to read himself, which was pretty unusual for kings back then. He created what historians call the Carolingonian Renaissance, which means the time when Charlemagne made learning cool again. But Charlemagne's biggest contribution was creating the idea of a unified Christian Europe. He was crowned emperor by the Pope on Christmas Day in the year 800, which established the idea that political power and religious authority should work together. This created the foundation for what would become the Holy Roman Empire and influenced European politics for the next 1,000 years. Every time you see European countries working together today, every time someone talks about Western civilization, every time you hear about the relationship between church and state, you're seeing Charlemagne's influence. He basically invented the idea that Europe could be one big community of related countries instead of just a bunch of tribes fighting each other. And finally, we have Genghis Khan, who lived about 800 years ago and created the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his descendants stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It was so big that you could travel from Poland to Korea and never leave Mongol territory. Now, most people think of Genghis Khan as just a brutal conqueror, and he definitely was that, but he was also an incredibly innovative leader who created systems that were way ahead of their time. He promoted people based on merit instead of birth, which means if you were smart and capable, you could become important even if your parents weren't nobles. He established religious tolerance throughout his empire, created the first international postal system, and even had a form of diplomatic immunity for ambassadors. The Mongol Empire connected the East and West in ways that had never happened before. Ideas, technologies, and trade goods flowed along the Silk Road under Mongol protection. Paper, money, gunpowder, and the printing press all spread from China to Europe because of Mongol trade networks. Even diseases spread along these routes, including the plague that devastated Europe in the 1300s. Genghis Khan basically created the first global economy, the idea that goods and ideas should flow freely between countries. That trade makes anyone richer, and that different cultures can benefit from contact with each other, all traced back to the Mongol Empire. Every time you buy something made in another country, every time you use technology that was invented somewhere else, you're participating in a global system that Genghis Khan helped create. These 6 kings didn't just rule their countries and then disappear into the history books. They created ideas and systems that became the foundation for how we live today. Hammurabi gave us written laws and the idea of justice. Cyrus gave us religious freedom and human rights. Alexander spread knowledge and created the first global culture. Augustus invented professional government and public services. Charlemagne unified Europe and connected political and religious authority. Genghis Khan created the first global economy and promoted people based on their ability rather than birth. When you go to school, you're benefiting from Charlemagne's idea that education matters. When you practice your religion freely, you're using the rights that Cyrus first established. When you expect the same punishment for the same crime, you're relying on Hammurabi's concept of written law. When you use government services like roads and mail, you're using systems that Augustus perfected. When you learn about different cultures and ideas from around the world, you're participating in the kind of cultural exchange that Alexander prompted. And when you see people get jobs based on their skill rather than who their parents are, you're seeing Genghis Khan's merit-based system at work. And so, there you have it. 6 ancient kings who shaped the modern world through their conquests, reforms, and big ideas. They proved that being a ruler isn't just about wearing a fancy crown and sitting on a throne. It's about creating systems and ideas that make life better for people, sometimes for thousands of years after you're gone. Now go forth and rule your own little kingdom with wisdom. Just try not to conquer any neighboring territories before dinner time.